If you don't want to go to the nursing home, then go to work, said my son while I was taking care of the kids. I quietly stood up and packed my suitcase. Minutes later, a luxury car honked at the gate to pick me up. It was my new rich husband. The morning had begun like any other in the Henderson household. The smell of toast and eggs wafted through the narrow hallway, mixing with the distant chatter of cartoons and the clatter of cereal bowls. Margaret moved with quiet precision, her slippers gliding across the tiled kitchen floor as she filled 3 lunch boxes with sandwiches, juice boxes, and apple slices. She had performed this routine for years, as dependable as sunrise, but not once had she paused to ask if she was happy. She didn't need to. Her family needed her, and that had always been enough. Or so she thought. The twins, Mason and Lily, were arguing over who got the blue cup, while Emma, the youngest, was teetering dangerously on a chair. Margaret swooped in to steady her, her hand steady despite the tremble in her knees. She had turned 62 last month. Though no one remembered, she hadn't expected a party. A simple happy birthday, Mom would have sufficed. But the day came and went like any other. That morning, her son Daniel shuffled into the kitchen, late as usual, tie half done, phone in one hand, travel mug in the other. He barely glanced up as he spoke. "Mom, where's my charger? And the twins need their jackets. It's cold today." "I already put them on the bench," Margaret said gently. "And your charger's by the stairs where you left it yesterday." "Of course." He sighed, clearly irritated. "Look, we can't keep doing this. If you're not going to go to a retirement home, maybe you should at least get a job. Help out somehow." The words landed with a thud, not shouted, not said in anger, just dropped carelessly between spoonfuls of oatmeal and the morning news. But they echoed louder than any scream. Margaret froze, her hand resting on the back of a kitchen chair. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Daniel didn't notice. He was already gathering his things, shouting over his shoulder for the kids to hurry. His wife, Jessica, was upstairs on a work call, too busy to intervene. No one saw Margaret sit down slowly, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the sky was gray, heavy with the threat of rain. She took a sip of her lukewarm tea and let the silence fill her chest like water. She had given everything to this family, raised Daniel alone after his father died in a car crash, put off dreams, friendships, even basic pleasures, to make sure he had every chance he didn't. And now she was a burden. She waited until the house emptied. The door slammed. The car engine revved and pulled away. Only then did she stand, her movement steady but deliberate. She climbed the stairs one step at a time, walked to the small guest room that had become her sanctuary, and pulled out her suitcase from under the bed. Her hands didn't shake as she folded her clothes. Sweaters, comfortable pants, the blue dress she always loved but rarely wore. She placed them with care, like she was preparing for a journey not just of distance, but of identity. From the closet, she pulled out an old hat box tucked behind winter coats. Inside were things no one knew she had kept. A faded photograph of her younger self at the beach, a silver locket, and a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon. She sat on the bed and untied the ribbon, revealing carefully preserved pages in cursive ink. They were from Robert Wallace. The name alone brought a surge of memory, his laugh, his hands always stained with vineyard soil, the way he called her Maggie like it was their secret. He was her first love, the one she left behind when life demanded she grow up too fast. Pregnant, scared, and determined, she had chosen the path of responsibility. Robert had written for years afterward, offering her a different life, one she never dared take. The last letter was different, more recent. She had found him on social media during a lonely evening last fall and sent a brief message, unsure if he'd reply. He did. And in his final message, just 4 months ago, he wrote, "If you ever want to start over, My door is still open. Always has been. Margaret read the sentence again, her fingers brushing the ink as if to test its warmth. She placed the letter carefully in her purse, zipped the suitcase, and wheeled it to the front door. She left a note on the kitchen counter. Not angry, not dramatic, just honest. I need to remember who I am. I'll be safe. Don't worry. As she stepped onto the porch, the sky had begun to drizzle. The air smelled of wet earth and quiet possibility. A sleek black car waited at the curb. She didn't recognize the driver, but he stepped out and opened the door with practiced grace. "Ms. Margaret Henderson?" he asked. She nodded. "Mr. Wallace sent me." Margaret hesitated for the briefest of moments. Then she smiled. "Let's go." And just like that, she left, not to run away, but to return to herself. The ride to Napa Valley stretched before her like a ribbon of possibility. Margaret sat in the back seat of the luxury sedan, her suitcase beside her and the letter from Robert folded neatly in her purse. She didn't ask the driver questions. She didn't need to. Every passing mile away from her son's house felt like a breath of air finally drawn after years underwater. Trees blurred by in hues of green and gold, and for the first time in a long while, the world outside seemed wider than the confines of one family's needs. She wasn't sure what she would find at the other end, but something inside her, the part that had been silent for decades, was wide awake. When they arrived, the gate to the estate opened slowly, revealing a property framed by gentle hills and endless rows of grapevines. It wasn't ostentatious. It was serene. Clean gravel crunched beneath the tires, and a winding path led up to a house that looked more like a home than a mansion. As the car rolled to a stop, the front door opened, and Robert stepped out. He had aged, of course. His once dark hair was now silver, and lines traced the corners of his eyes and mouth. But his presence was the same, calm, grounded, quietly charismatic. He wore a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his hands were stained with what looked like wine or soil, maybe both. When he saw her, he smiled, not a grin of surprise or uncertainty, but one of quiet certainty, like a man who had been expecting someone he knew would come. "Margaret," he said, simply. She stepped out of the car, steady despite the flurry of nerves beneath her calm expression. She hadn't rehearsed what she would say. She didn't have to. "Robert," she replied, walking forward. He took her hands without hesitation, and the contact sent a strange warmth through her arms and into her chest. There was nothing romantic or force in the gesture, just recognition. Two lives, stretched by time and circumstance, now gently realigned. "You're here," he said, more to himself than to her. She nodded. "I didn't think I would be, but here I am." He didn't press. Instead, he guided her inside, showing her to a guest room that overlooked the vineyard. The space was modest but full of light, with sheer curtains that moved softly in the breeze and a quilted bedspread in pale blues and greens. She set her bag down and stood by the window, watching the late afternoon sun paint the fields in amber. That night, over a quiet dinner of grilled fish, roasted vegetables, and a bottle of Merlot from his own vineyard, Margaret and Robert began to speak. Not of the present, but of what had never been spoken aloud. Robert asked nothing about Daniel or her reasons for leaving. He didn't need to. Instead, he shared stories of the years between. How his father passed down the winery to him. How he and his late wife, Claire, had built a life here. He mentioned Claire with a softness that moved Margaret. There was no bitterness, only memory. He had loved deeply, and now he lived with that love folded into the landscape of his life. Margaret, in turn, spoke of things she had never told anyone, not even Daniel. She spoke of the loneliness that crept in after the diapers and school lunches and teenage crises had passed, of the quiet humiliation of being overlooked, of the way her identity had been stripped away, not all at once, but piece by piece, until she became a fixture in the background of someone else's story. She spoke with a voice that trembled at first, but grew stronger as Robert listened, never interrupting, never turning away. "You were always the strongest person I knew," he said softly when she paused. "Even then, especially then." Margaret looked at him, the weight of years pressing against her chest. "I didn't feel strong. I just kept going. That's strength too, he said, sometimes more than anything else. The next morning, Margaret rose early, drawn outside by the smell of dew and earth. She wandered between the rows of grapevines, letting her fingers brush the leaves. The estate was alive with quiet work. Field hands pruning vines, crates being loaded, the faint hum of machinery somewhere in the distance. Robert met her near the old stone well, offering her a cup of coffee and a gentle smile. I'm hosting a tasting this afternoon, he said. Just a small group, nothing fancy. Would you like to sit in? She hesitated, surprised. You want me there? I think you'll like it. You have a presence, Margaret. Always did. She did attend. She sat quietly at a shaded table as visitors sipped from crystal glasses and asked questions about tannins and climate and barrel aging. Robert moved through the group with ease, his explanations laced with charm and deep knowledge. Occasionally, he glanced at her, not to check if she was comfortable, but to share the moment, as though she belonged there. And she felt, unexpectedly, that she did. In the days that followed, Margaret found herself falling into a rhythm she hadn't known she missed. She helped prepare meals in the sunlit kitchen, walked the grounds in the evenings with Robert, and spent quiet afternoons reading on the porch. No one asked her for anything. No one interrupted her thoughts. And for the first time in years, she began writing again, small observations, reflections, pages that had no purpose except to exist. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, she sat beside Robert on the porch, a blanket over her lap and a glass of wine in her hand. The air smelled of lavender and oak. She turned to him and asked, not as a challenge, but as a curiosity, "Did you really think I'd come?" He looked at her, eyes crinkled with the hint of a smile. "I never stop hoping." Margaret said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "I never stopped thinking about you either." He nodded, as if he already knew, and in that moment, the years they had lost no longer felt like a void. They felt like a path, long, winding, and hard, but one that had led them, finally, to this place. The days became weeks, and in the quiet rhythm of the vineyard, Margaret found herself not just resting, but changing. At first, she simply observed. She watched the way the staff moved with purpose and precision, the way Robert greeted everyone by name, how the landscape shifted with the light, softening in the mornings, glowing in the late afternoons. But soon, observation turned to participation, not out of obligation, but from a kind of joy she hadn't known she still possessed. She began helping in the kitchen, first timidly, chopping herbs or preparing fruit trays for tasting events. Before long, she was taking over entire meals, planning menus, baking loaves of bread, experimenting with sauces and pairings that delighted even Robert's most seasoned guests. One Thursday morning, as she stood at the large marble counter arranging crostinis with a fig spread she had perfected, one of the staff, a young woman named Elena, leaned in and whispered, "Everyone loves your cooking. Mr. Wallace hasn't eaten this well in years." Margaret smiled but said nothing. The compliment was welcome, but what moved her more was a feeling of being needed again, in a way that respected her rather than consumed her. Here, her contributions were acknowledged without being expected. Her presence was seen, not simply used. Robert, meanwhile, gave her space but remained near. Their companionship deepened in quiet ways. Shared breakfast on the terrace, walks through the vines where conversation drifted between memory and dreams, evenings where music played low as they sipped wine and read side by side. There was no pressure between them, no declarations or plans, only a growing sense of ease that came from knowing they were both where they were meant to be. One afternoon, as she was sorting through a crate of tomatoes freshly picked from the garden, Robert came in holding 2 glasses and a bottle of a new blend he had been working on. He poured a little into each glass and held one out to her. "I think this one has promise," he said. "Let me know what you think." Margaret tasted it slowly, letting the flavor unfold. "It's bolder than your last," she said, thoughtful. More forward, confident even. He raised his eyebrows, impressed. "That's exactly what I was going for." She laughed softly. "Maybe I picked up a few things." "I hope you've picked up more than that," he said, and his voice carried something unspoken that hung in the air between them. But he didn't push further. He didn't need to. It was around that time, that Margaret began exploring beyond the vineyard. She visited the nearby town, charming and sun-drenched, with its antique shops, art galleries, and cafes where strangers smiled easily. She bought a journal from a bookstore on a cobblestone side street, and each morning she wrote in it while sipping coffee on the veranda. Not just lists or reflections, but real writing. Stories, pieces of memory, conversations imagined and real. It surprised her how naturally it came back, like a language she had once spoken fluently and forgotten only because there was never time to use it. One evening, Robert found her sitting at the dining room table. Pages spread out before her, a pen in her hand, brow furrowed in concentration. "Is that what I think it is?" he asked, gently. She looked up, caught. "It's nothing, just some writing." He walked over, picked up a page, and read the first line silently. Then he smiled. "This is beautiful, Margaret. You should keep going." She didn't argue. For the first time, she believed it too. That night, as the stars came out over the valley, she allowed herself to think about permanence, not as a commitment made in haste, but as a recognition of what had already begun. Her room, once the guest room, now felt like hers. Her clothing hung beside Robert's in the shared closet. Her laughter filled the kitchen. Her voice was heard at the dinner table. Slowly, without announcement, she had become part of the fabric of the place. Still, she wondered how long it would last. Not because she doubted Robert's intentions, but because part of her still struggled with the guilt of having left. Though she had written a letter to Daniel before departing, she had not heard from him since. She didn't expect him to reach out, but part of her hoped. One afternoon, as summer began to turn its face toward fall, Robert handed her a small box wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside was a key, a small brass thing, smooth with age but still solid. "It's to the cottage," he said, "the one near the east slope. It's not much, but it's quiet and has a view of the lake. I thought maybe if you wanted a space of your own." Margaret was silent for a long moment, touched in a way she couldn't articulate, not because she wanted distance from him, but because the gesture acknowledged her as a whole person, someone with her own inner life. "I would love that," she said at last. Over the next few weeks, the cottage became her sanctuary. She filled it with books and linen she chose herself, paintings from local artists, a small writing desk by the window. It was the first time in years she had lived in a space entirely of her own making. Each morning, she walked down to the main house, sometimes to cook, sometimes just to join Robert for breakfast. Each evening, she returned to her cottage and wrote until sleep called her. Her writing grew, not just in quantity but in meaning. She began to shape her journal entries into something more deliberate, a manuscript, maybe, though she didn't call it that yet, a reflection on aging, on invisibility, on rediscovery. She wrote not as a victim, but as a witness to her own life, carving a space in the world for women like her. One crisp morning, as she walked the vineyard paths in the sweater Robert had given her, the wind carrying the scent of crushed grapes, she stopped and looked out over the land. The rows of vines seemed endless, steady, resilient. Much like her, she had not come here to fall in love again, though perhaps she had. She had not come to be saved, though in some ways she had been. She had come because someone had finally reminded her that she mattered, and that, she realized, was the beginning of everything. It was a Sunday afternoon when the pastor arrived on the gravel path of the vineyard. The sun was high, the wind soft, and Margaret had just finished organizing her notes for a chapter she'd been struggling with all week. She had taken to writing outdoors lately, near the old wooden pergola by the lavender field, where the quiet seemed to help her untangle thoughts that resisted the page. That day it felt unusually serene, the kind of peace that sinks into your bones and convinces you, for a moment, that life has finally settled. Until a shadow fell across her notebook. She looked up and saw Daniel. He stood hesitantly at the edge of the pergola, his shoulders hunched, the collar of his shirt slightly wrinkled, like he had been driving for hours without stopping. Behind him, in the distance, the silhouettes of 3 children climbed slowly from a dusty SUV. Her breath caught, not in shock, but in recognition of something she had always suspected would come. This reckoning between who she had become and who she used to be. Daniel's voice broke the silence first. "Mom." Margaret didn't rise immediately. She placed her pen down, closed a notebook, and let her gaze linger on him a moment longer. The last time she had seen her son, he had barely looked at her. Now, he looked like a man on the verge of breaking. She finally stood and walked toward him. "Daniel," she said simply. His eyes were red, not just from the long drive, but from something deeper. He glanced around awkwardly, unsure whether to approach or wait to be invited. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, voice rough. "Jessica left. She took a job in Seattle. Said she needed space. I don't know what I'm doing. I've been sleeping on the couch. The kids are confused, and I thought maybe you could help." Margaret listened without interrupting. She noticed how the confident sharpness in his tone was gone, replaced by the uncertainty of a man who finally saw the edge of his limits. She motioned for him to follow her and led him to a bench beneath the vine-covered trellis. They sat without speaking for a long moment. "I didn't come here to fix things," she said gently. "I came here because I had to save myself." Daniel looked down at his hands. "I know. I didn't understand then, but I think I do now." In the distance, the children were standing by the car. Emma was holding her brother's hand, Lily picking at the hem of her dress. They hadn't spotted her yet. Margaret turned toward him. "What you said to me that morning, whether you meant it or not, made me realize how far I'd disappeared into your life without ever being seen. I needed to remember who I was before I became just mom or grandma." Daniel rubbed his face, ashamed. "I was overwhelmed. I thought I could handle everything, and I failed." "No," she said, her tone firm. "You didn't fail. You lived the life you built. But you expected me to carry it with you without ever asking if I could." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm sorry." Margaret placed a hand on his. "I forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't mean going back." Just then, Robert approached quietly, respectfully. He gave Margaret a questioning glance, and she nodded. Robert turned to Daniel and extended a hand. "You must be Daniel," he said. "I'm Robert." Daniel stood and shook his hand, visibly surprised. "Nice to meet you. Thank you for looking after my mom." Robert only smiled. "She doesn't need looking after. She's the strongest person on this estate." There was a silence between them, brief but not uncomfortable. Then Robert gestured toward the house. "Would the kids like something to eat? We're making fresh bread and fruit tarts." Margaret nodded. "Bring them over," she said to Daniel. He turned and waved the children toward them. As they ran across the gravel path, Margaret stood to meet them, arms open. Emma reached her first, burying her face in Margaret's waist, followed closely by the twins. She knelt to hug them, holding them tightly, her throat aching with a mix of joy and sorrow. They smelled of road trip snacks and sunscreen, and their little voices all spoke at once. "Grandma, where are we? Is this your house? Can we stay?" Margaret smiled, her heart full. "It's not my house, but it's my home now." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the kitchen, where Margaret and the children kneaded dough while Daniel stood back, unsure of his place. Robert poured lemonade and made polite conversation, allowing the family to reconnect without intrusion. Later, when the sun began to dip, Margaret took her son on a walk to the rows of vines. Just the two of them. "This place," he said quietly, "it suits you." "I know," she replied. "I kept thinking, maybe you come back," he admitted. Margaret paused, looking out across the hills. "I can't go back, but I'm not abandoning you. I just need to live as myself now." "I want to learn," he said softly, "how to do that too." She looked at him, finally seeing not just the boy she raised, but the man still growing. "That's your journey, just like this was mine." When they returned to the house, the kids were asleep on the sofa, wrapped in quilts, while Robert was quietly cleaning up in the kitchen. Margaret kissed her grandchildren's foreheads, brushed the hair from Emma's face, and then turned to Daniel. "You can stay the night," she said, "but tomorrow you have to keep going. You'll figure it out." He nodded, accepting the terms not as rejection, but as truth. And that night, while the house settled into sleep, Margaret sat in her cottage, lit a candle, and opened her notebook again. The next chapter was ready to be written. Margaret sat quietly on the veranda, the manuscript heavy in her lap, the breeze rustling its pages. It had taken a year to finish. A year marked not by days on a calendar, but by moment of clarity, conversations over wine, quiet walks through lavender fields, and occasional visits back east. She had carefully stitched together pieces of her own story, woven with others she'd gathered. Conversations shared with women she'd met along the way, strangers who became confidants. She had titled it simply, The Courage to Begin Again. Robert approached, settling into a chair beside her, carrying 2 glasses of Cabernet. The day was warm, fading slowly into an evening that stretched lazily across the hills. They had grown comfortable in each other's quiet, and yet every day still felt precious. "Do you think it's ready?" he asked softly, nodding toward the manuscript. Margaret smiled. "I think I finally am." Within weeks, the book was accepted by a publisher. Margaret didn't expect much, not fame, not recognition, but she hoped for resonance, for connection. She had lived quietly for so long that stepping into the open felt unfamiliar yet necessary. Soon, invitations arrived, small bookstores, women's groups, podcasts dedicated to aging boldly and authentically. Each event became not just a presentation, but a conversation, deep and honest, about the cost and reward of reclaiming oneself. Through it all, Robert stood beside her, quietly proud but never overshadowing. Their relationship deepened effortlessly, becoming a partnership that respected boundaries while cherishing closeness. Eventually, Margaret moved permanently into the main house, not because she had to, but because it felt natural to share space fully again, this time without sacrificing any part of herself. As the book gained attention, Margaret found herself frequently returning east, visiting Daniel and the children. Daniel had slowly pieced his life back together. His new apartment was small but cozy, filled with the laughter of her grandchildren. Jessica had returned to their lives cautiously, not as a spouse, but as a co-parent and friend, bridging a peace Margaret hoped would last. During one of her visits, Margaret sat with Daniel late one night on his balcony, overlooking the city lights. He poured tea quietly, handing her a cup without needing to ask how she took it. "I read your book," he said after a long silence. "Every word." Margaret glanced at him, surprised, and he smiled gently. "I finally understand what you did. It wasn't just about leaving. It was about surviving. You needed to survive." Margaret touched his arm gently. "Not just survive, to live again." Daniel nodded, his eyes shining with tears he no longer hid from her. "I wish I'd known sooner. Not just for you, but for me too." "It's never too late," she whispered, and they both understood she wasn't talking only about herself. Back in Napa, Robert continued expanding the vineyard, adding new varietals and experimenting with blends that drew attention from wine enthusiasts around the world. Margaret became more involved in the business side of things, fascinated by the complexities of winemaking, blending her newfound creativity with a sense of practical satisfaction. Together they traveled occasionally, trips to Italy, France, and Spain, not just for business, but because they could, because life had granted them this unexpected and rare second chance. One afternoon, Margaret received a letter, one among many, but this one caught her eye. It was handwritten, shaky but legible, from a woman named Eleanor, 75 years old and newly widowed. She had read Margaret's book, and the message ended simply with, "I'm writing this from a cafe in Paris. I finally went. You showed me how." Margaret read it twice, slowly, her heart swelling. She shared it later with Robert over dinner. "This," she said, "is why I wrote the book, to help others find the door I stumbled through." He lifted his glass, eyes warm, to many more doors. Time moved on gently, marked by harvest seasons, family holidays spent between two coasts, and evenings filled with quiet companionship. Eventually, Margaret and Robert married quietly, a small ceremony beneath the old oak tree near the vineyard. Daniel and the children attended, throwing petals in the air, laughter mingling easily with tears. The ceremony was simple but deeply symbolic, a reminder that life could still hold surprises, joy, and a capacity for deep love, even after loss, even after pain. Years later, Margaret stood in a crowded auditorium, preparing to speak at a women's conference. She held the podium lightly, smiling as applause faded. Her hair was silver now, her face softened by age but lit from within by a quiet confidence she'd earned through hard decisions and reclaimed dreams. "When I was younger," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I believed my life would follow one path. Then, as years passed, I forgot that I had a choice. But here's what I learned. What seemed like the end was actually a beginning. Each of us carries within us the power to choose again, no matter our age, no matter how far down the road we traveled." The audience was silent, listening closely. Margaret took a breath, steadying herself. "Remember that you matter, not only to others, but to yourself. You deserve joy and peace and purpose, no matter how long you've waited." When she finished, applause erupted, women rising to their feet, some with tears streaming openly down their faces. Margaret felt her heart swell again, not with pride, but with gratitude. Gratitude for Robert's gentle strength, for Daniel's growth, for grandchildren who knew her now as a woman full of life, not just as their grandmother. Gratitude for herself, for taking the step out the door that day, suitcase in hand, unsure but determined. Afterward, Margaret signed books and spoke briefly with each woman who approached. Near the end of the line, a familiar face appeared. Jessica stood before her, hesitant yet hopeful. "Margaret," she began softly, voice trembling, "I had to come. I needed to say thank you for everything." Margaret took Jessica's hands warmly, meeting her gaze with genuine kindness. "We all deserve second chances. It's what we do with them that counts." Late that evening, Margaret returned to Napa. Robert waited by the front door, holding 2 glasses of wine. She stepped into his embrace, breathing in deeply the scent of lavender, oak, and wine. "Welcome home," he whispered softly. She smiled, kissing him gently. "I always am." The sky above the vineyard was dark, glittering quietly with stars, each one a silent testament to beginnings that waited, endlessly patient, for those brave enough to claim them. The end,